What if the person you help today is the same person who once saved your life and you never knew? A retired Marine and his loyal German Shepherd walk into a grocery store, and within minutes, everything they thought they knew about their past is shattered. An elderly woman collapses. He steps in to help, just doing what any good man would do. But the dog reacts first, not with fear, but with recognition, as if he has met her before. Days later, a forgotten photo album reveals the truth. 40 years ago, during a battlefield night, no one expected him to survive. This same woman was the nurse who held his hand and refused to let him die. He lived his entire life never knowing her name, until God brought them back together in the most unexpected way. If you believe kindness returns, if you believe God writes stories better than we ever could, then stay with us until the end. Comment where you're watching from, subscribe for more stories like this, and may God bless everyone seeing this video. The small town of Missoula, Montana, rested under the quiet chill of an early autumn morning, the kind where the air felt sharp enough to sting the lungs and the wind carried dried brown leaves that scraped softly along the sidewalks. The sun had risen, but it was a faint and gentle light filtered through a pale, cloud-washed sky, the kind that made everything look slightly muted, as if the world itself was moving a little slower than usual. Most people in town were already used to this kind of weather, crisp, a bit lonely, but honest. The way small American towns often were when tourist season had already passed and winter was waiting at the door. Along the edge of the main road stood a modest Walmart, its parking lot half full, the blue sign flickering softly as if struggling against the wind. And it was here that Michael Grant pulled up in his old, dusty Ford truck, the kind of vehicle that looked like it had earned every scratch, every dent, every story. Michael was 62 years old, tall but slightly slouched from years of carrying more weight on his shoulders than most people ever saw. His hair, once jet black when he was a young Marine, had now turned into a mix of gray streaks and rough silver patches. His face was carved by time and sand and battle, deep lines along the forehead, faint scars along his jaw, and a still strong, square chin that had once made him look fierce, but now only made him look tired in a dignified way. He kept a short, well-trimmed beard, mostly gray, and wore a simple dark green jacket, faded jeans, and old combat boots that he never fully gave up, not even after leaving the service decades ago. His eyes, a pale blue, were the kind that seemed to always be somewhere else, always measuring, always remembering, like a man who had seen too much and never fully came back home, even when his body did. Beside him jumped down a large German shepherd named Rex, 7 years old, strong, disciplined, and alert. Rex's coat was a deep blend of black and tan, with bright amber eyes that seemed to study everything, the people, the cars, even the air itself. He moved with the calm certainty of a trained working dog, tail low, ears attentive, as if he understood more than he could ever express. Michael had adopted Rex after the dog's former handler, another Marine, passed away. Since then, Rex had become more than a companion. He was the unspoken bridge between the past and whatever life Michael still had left. The dog was loyal, protective, and smart, with a habit of quietly leaning his head against Michael's leg in moments when silence felt too heavy. They entered the store together, earning a few familiar nods. People in town didn't know much about Michael, only that he lived in a small cabin by the woods, worked on local repair jobs, and didn't talk about his past unless someone insisted. He wasn't unfriendly, just quiet, like a man who'd found peace in being unnoticed. Inside the Walmart, the Tauker fluorescent lights buzzed. The air smelled faintly of cardboard and detergent, and customers moved slowly in aisles filled with early holiday decorations. Michael pushed a cart with one hand, while Rex walked close at his side, never needing a leash. He was there for a few supplies: dog food for Rex, canned beans, a pack of nails, and a small roll of sandpaper for a wooden cabinet he was restoring. Everything about his routine was simple, consistent, almost ceremonial. The kind of life someone builds when he no longer expects surprises. But life has a way of sending quiet storms into quiet days. Near the end of aisle 6, not far from the dairy fridges, an elderly woman stood alone, gripping the handle of her cart, as if the world had suddenly tilted. She looked to be in her late 60s, perhaps 68, with soft, silver-white hair pulled into a loose bun and thin-framed glasses sliding slightly down her nose. Her skin was pale, the kind of pale that comes not from winter but from fatigue tucked deep beneath the surface, and her hands trembled faintly as they held onto the cart. She wore a simple beige coat, a light blue knitted scarf, and shoes that looked comfortable but worn at the heel. There was something gentle in her face, a softness in her eyes, a warmth in her smile lines that hinted she had once laughed often and cared deeply. Michael didn't notice her at first, but Rex did. The dog stopped, ears pointed forward, body tensed, not in aggression, but in recognition, as if he had caught a memory in the air. Michael turned just in time to see the woman sway, lose her balance, and collapse to the cold, tiled floor. Without hesitation, he rushed over, kneeling beside her. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" His voice was calm but firm, the voice of a man who had given orders under fire, a voice built for emergencies. The woman's eyes fluttered but didn't open fully. Michael checked her pulse. It was faint but present. Another customer gasped and called for help, and within moments a store employee arrived, panic written all over his young face. Michael stayed steady, guiding the moment the way he used to guide frightened soldiers. "Call 911, he instructed. "She needs medical attention, but she's breathing. Tell them she may have fainted." The employee nodded and stumbled off with his phone. Rex stayed right beside the woman, lowering his head, sniffing gently near her shoulder, tail still but alert. There was something unusually focused in the dog's behavior, something Michael noticed and filed away in his mind, though he couldn't make sense of it yet. When the paramedics arrived, 2 of them helped her onto a stretcher. One of them, a young man with freckled skin and nervous hands, asked, "Are you family?" Michael shook his head. "Just happened to be here. I'll follow you. Make sure she gets home safe if she needs it." The paramedic nodded, grateful for help. Not everyone offered to stay once the sirens arrived. The woman regained consciousness briefly, her voice thin. I'm sorry. I don't know what happened." "You're okay," Michael said gently. "You're going to the hospital. I'll make sure your things are taken care of." She looked at him for a moment, as if searching for something familiar in his face, but her vision was still blurred. "Thank you. I'm Helen." That was all she managed before exhaustion pulled her back into silence. Later, after the hospital discharged her with instructions to rest, Michael drove her home in his truck, Rex curled in the back seat. The drive was quiet, the sky already shifting to a soft evening gray. Helen lived in a small white house with a front porch and flower boxes that had once been colorful but were now mostly empty, as if she had stopped tending them recently. Michael helped her inside, placed her groceries on the table, and made sure she had water and medication in reach. She thanked him again, her voice still soft, but warmer now. "I don't know what I would have done without you," she said. "Anyone would have done the same," Michael replied, though he knew not everyone would. He turned to leave, but Rex didn't follow. Instead, the German shepherd walked toward Helen again, slowly, tail wagging, not in excitement, but in deep, strange recognition. He sniffed her hand, then her sleeve, then looked back at Michael with an expression that almost said, "You're missing something." "I know this person." Michael frowned slightly. Rex never behaved that way with strangers. Something about this woman, something about her scent, her presence, had stirred a memory in the dog. And Michael felt, for the first time that day, that this wasn't a random act of kindness. Something had just begun. In the days that followed, Michael found himself returning to Helen's house more often than he expected. At first, he told himself it was simply to check whether she needed help carrying groceries or repairing something around the place. But the quiet pull that kept bringing him back felt deeper than duty. Her home sat at the edge of a quiet neighborhood lined with maple trees, their leaves turning amber and red as autumn settled in. The white paint on her porch railings was chipped. The wooden steps sagged slightly in the middle, and the flower beds that once held rows of marigolds and lavender were now dry, with only a few stubborn stems clinging to life. It was the kind of house that still held warmth, just not the strength to stand on its own anymore. When Helen opened the door each time he visited, she wore the same gentle expression, the soft kind that made people feel as if they had been expected, even when they hadn't been. She was dressed simply, usually in a knitted sweater with earth-toned colors and long skirts, as if comfort mattered more than appearance. Her movements were slow but deliberate, and though her smile always appeared sincere, there was a subtle hesitation behind her eyes, like a woman trying to place a memory she could almost touch, but not fully grasp. She never asked why Michael came back so often, and he never tried to explain. In a way, both seemed content with the unspoken agreement that some connections did not need reason. Michael repaired a loose porch board one afternoon, the sound of hammering echoing gently through the yard, while Rex lay near Helen's feet on the porch, head resting on his paws. The dog seemed unusually drawn to her, not in playful excitement, but in loyal presence, like a guardian watching over something precious. He would follow her from room to room, sit beside her when she read, and tilt his head at her voice as though it carried a familiar tone lost somewhere in time. Michael noticed it more each day, the way Rex watched her, not with curiosity, but remembrance. It puzzled him, because Rex had never acted this way with anyone else. Sometimes, Helen would pause mid-sentence while speaking to Michael, her eyes narrowing in concentration, as if something about him tugged lightly on a memory she couldn't retrieve. "You have a way of helping without making someone feel like a burden," she said once, running a hand gently along Rex's head. "It's rare these days." Michael didn't know how to respond, so he just nodded, tightening the hinge on her kitchen cabinet. There was something soothing about the routine, sweeping leaves from the walkway, oiling the creaking gate, trimming the overgrown branches in her yard. It reminded him of a life he might have had if war hadn't carved so many years out of him. He even talked more, which surprised him. Not about combat or the darkest echoes of memory, but about small things, woodworking projects, fishing trips he never took, and the cabin he was slowly repairing out in the woods. Helen listened with a softness that didn't rush or judge. She spoke in return about books she loved, the way she used to tend flowers before her hands grew stiff, and the loneliness that crept in after the last of her family moved away. But neither of them said anything about the strange familiarity that ran beneath every conversation, like the faint sound of a song someone had heard long ago. One afternoon, as Michael raked leaves in her yard, a cold breeze swept through, sending a cascade of red maple leaves swirling across the lawn. Helen watched from her rocking chair on the porch, a blanket across her knees, and Rex sat beside her, alert but calm. "He really likes you," Michael said, glancing at the dog. Helen smiled and softly scratched behind Rex's ear. "I've always loved dogs, but this one, he feels different, as if he's known me longer than I've known him." She laughed quietly, but there was a tremor of truth in her voice that neither of them understood yet. "That makes two of us," Michael said, before he realized he'd spoken the thought aloud. He quickly turned back to the rake, but Helen didn't question it. She only watched him carefully, eyes thoughtful, as though another piece of a puzzle had shifted into place. When the afternoon grew colder, Michael carried in a box of supplies he had picked up for her. New light bulbs, replacement screen hinges, and a stack of firewood he had split himself. Helen thanked him again, her voice steady but filled with something more than gratitude, something layered in history she had not yet uncovered. "You don't have to keep helping like this," she said softly. "I know," he replied, "but I want to." She lowered her gaze, touched by the simplicity of the answer. For a moment, neither spoke. Only the ticking of the old wall clock in her living room filled the silence, along with the soft sound of Rex's breath as he lay at her feet. The dog watched Helen the entire time, eyes gentle but alert, as if protecting a memory none of them could name. And though neither Michael nor Helen understood why their lives had woven together so naturally, Rex seemed to understand perfectly. Something had returned. Something had been waiting. And though it was quiet now, it was already moving toward a truth neither of them was ready for. The afternoon sun filtered through the thin curtains in Helen's living room, casting soft stripes of light across the wooden floor as Michael carried in a box of unused tools and old blankets she had asked him to help sort. The room smelled faintly of lavender oil and old books, the kind of scent that lived in homes where time no longer rushed, only settled. Rex trotted in behind him, nails tapping lightly against the floor as he scanned the room with quiet alertness, tail low, ears turning at every small sound. Michael placed the box near a stack of items Helen wanted to donate, then noticed a cabinet door that hung crooked on its hinge. He reached for his screwdriver, and Helen, sitting in her old upholstered chair, gave him that familiar smile, the one that never rushed, never demanded, only thanked without words. Her silver hair was pinned loosely today, and she wore a soft rose-colored sweater that made her look almost younger, though her fingers trembled slightly as she sorted envelopes. They had been cleaning for an hour when Helen paused, her expression thoughtful. "There's one more box upstairs," she said. "It's old things I never organized. I always meant to, but life gets in the way." Michael nodded, wiped his hands on a rag, and climbed the wooden stairs. The upper floor was smaller, lined with faded family pictures and framed pressed flowers. In the far corner of the hallway closet sat a cardboard box, its flaps slightly crushed, the ink label on top faded almost white. He lifted it carefully and brought it downstairs, where Helen watched with a hint of curiosity. "I haven't opened that in years," she murmured. Inside were objects wrapped in yellowed tissue, an old field armband with a faded red cross, a canvas pouch with rusted metal clasps, and a brown leather-bound album with corners worn down from time. The moment Michael touched it, something in him hesitated. though he couldn't explain why. He placed the album gently on the coffee table. Rex stood, ears forward, body tense, not in fear, but in awareness, the same alertness he had shown the day they first met Helen. Helen opened the album slowly, as if afraid the pages might crumble. Inside were black and white photographs, some washed to dusky gray, showing young nurses in field tents, soldiers on stretchers, and rows of makeshift cots under canvas roofs. Helen appeared in many of them, at least 40 years younger, wearing a medical uniform with sleeves rolled up, her hair tied back neatly, her face still carrying the same kindness, but marked with exhaustion and determination. She touched one photo with a lingering finger. "I was 23 here," she said softly. "We patched up whoever we could. It never felt like enough." Michael leaned closer, studying the photos not as memories, but as history he had never seen from the outside. He had served years after those pictures were taken, but war had a way of making decades feel like moments that never stopped echoing. Then Helen turned to a page that made both of them freeze, not because of fear, but recognition. The photo showed a young Marine lying on a field cot, bandages around his chest, a breathing tube taped near his mouth. Beside him, a younger Helen knelt, hands pressed firmly against his shoulder as if holding life in place. The soldier in the photo was him. Michael stared, unable to speak. The young man looked barely alive, face pale, hair dark with sweat, eyes closed in unconsciousness. He had no memory of that moment, not the tent, not the pain, not the woman who had been by his side. He had been 22 then, and had woken days later in a different ward, breathing, stitched together, never knowing who kept him from slipping away. Helen looked at the picture as though seeing a ghost she had not expected to return. "There was a boy," she whispered. "A Marine. They said he wouldn't make it through the night. I stayed with him until the morphine took him under. When I checked for him the next morning, he was gone. No name, no goodbye. Just transferred out." Her voice grew soft with the weight of years. "But he lived. I always prayed he lived." Michael took longer than he expected to find his words. "I never knew," he said, voice low and rough. "I woke up days later in another ward. They didn't tell me who saved me." He looked at her, eyes gentler than they had been in decades. I thought I just got lucky." Helen smiled, but it was a fragile smile, the kind that held both pride and ache. "It wasn't luck. Someone fought for you before you could fight for yourself." Rex stepped closer then, pressing his nose against the album before nudging it gently with his head, tail sweeping slowly across the floor. He let out a soft woof, not loud, not frantic, but purposeful, as if confirming a truth that had been living beneath silence. Helen chuckled through a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "Even he knows," she said softly. Michael rested a hand on Rex's back, feeling the steady breath beneath the fur. Something enormous had just shifted inside him. Something quiet, but seismic. Not a memory returning, but a debt he never knew existed suddenly taking shape. He looked at Helen again, and this time, there was no question of why he kept returning. The past had found him. And it had a face now. The discovery of the photograph lingered in the air long after the album was closed, like a door left half open to a room neither of them had entered in decades. The next few days passed more quietly than usual, not in discomfort, but in reflection. Michael found himself returning to Helen's house with a different weight in his steps, a feeling not of obligation, but of unfinished history. The autumn wind had grown sharper, the sky turning a soft steel gray, and the trees outside her porch now stood almost bare, their leaves forming rust-colored drifts along the walkway. Rex seemed more watchful than ever, staying close to both of them, as if understanding that something delicate and important hovered between them, waiting to be spoken. Inside the living room, the old wall clock ticked in slow rhythm while Helen arranged the last of the donated items into a cardboard box. Michael was repairing a loose window latch when she spoke his name softly, too softly at first to catch. "Mikey," she said again, and this time the name landed like a stone dropped into still water. He froze. No one had called him that in 40 years. Not since the military hospital where he'd been patched together after the bombing. Only his fellow Marines had used that name, and the nurses who had cared for them in those final, half-conscious nights. He turned slowly, not out of suspicion, but out of something deeper. Recognition his mind had not caught up to yet. Helen, unaware of what she had triggered, continued speaking. "You always work like you're racing time, Mikey, as if something in you never learned how to slow." She stopped. The look on his face told her she hadn't just used a nickname. She had opened a sealed part of his past. Michael's voice was quiet, but it carried a tremor he couldn't hide. "Why did you call me that?" Helen blinked, confused at first, then startled by her own words, as if they had slipped from a place she hadn't meant to reach. I don't know," she said. "It just felt familiar." Michael set the screwdriver down and sat across from her, hands clasped, shoulders tense. "Only a few people ever called me that," he said slowly. "And the last time I heard it, I was lying in a hospital bed, barely alive." Silence gathered like a held breath. Then, without planning to, without wanting to, a memory pushed its way through. The smell of antiseptic and canvas tent walls, the burning in his lungs, the fevered panic of a young man who wasn't ready to die. And then a voice, soft, close to his ear. "You will live. I'm here. Hold on." He had never seen the face that belonged to that voice. He had been too far under, drifting between worlds. But the words, the warmth, the steadiness, they had stayed buried in him like a lighthouse he never saw, but somehow followed anyway. He looked at Helen, really looked at her, and the lines of age seemed to shift like tracing paper over the long ago. Memory, the shape of her mouth, the calm in her eyes, the steady gentleness in her hands. "It was you," he said, voice still rough with disbelief. "You stayed with me. You're the one who said that to me." Helen's breathing caught. Her eyes widened, filling not with shock, but with recognition that had been waiting too long to surface. "You're that boy," she whispered, voice shaking. "The one I thought wouldn't make it. I held your hand all night. I prayed over you. I talked to you even though no one thought you could hear. And when I came back in the morning, you were gone." A tear ran down her cheek, not from sadness but from the overwhelming realization that the past had looped back, not to haunt her, but to finish a sentence that had never been completed. Michael exhaled slowly, as if releasing 40 years of unasked questions. "I woke up in another ward," he said. "No one told me your name. I didn't even know I'd been moved. I left that hospital thinking I'd just survived. I never knew someone fought for me before I could fight for myself." Rex suddenly stepped between them, placing his head gently against Helen's lap, tail beating the floor in a slow, knowing rhythm. Michael's eyes drifted toward the dog, understanding now what had puzzled him for days. "You recognized her before I did," he said quietly. "You knew her scent. You were trained to remember people through their scent patterns. Soldiers, handlers, medics. He turned back to Helen. Rex didn't just like you. He remembered you. Helen let out a soft, broken laugh, brushing her fingers through Rex's fur. After all these years, the dog knew before the human did. Michael nodded, his expression both humbled and stunned. I don't think this is coincidence, he said. I think this was unfinished. Helen looked at him, not as a kind stranger who had helped her in a supermarket, but as someone whose life had once been in her hands, someone she never expected to see again, and yet was sitting in her living room, fixing her window, carrying her groceries, watching over her as if the world had quietly returned a favor she had forgotten she was owed. The truth wasn't loud or dramatic. It was simple. It had always been waiting. The room felt different after the truth surfaced. Lighter, quieter, almost sacred in the way shared history can turn silence into understanding. Neither Michael nor Helen spoke for several moments after the realization settled between them, but nothing about the pause felt uncomfortable. It was as if time itself had stopped to acknowledge what had finally been put back in place after 40 years of wandering. Michael stood. Then, without warning and without the guardedness he had carried his entire adult life, he sank to one knee in front of Helen, his eyes beginning to blur with the weight of something he had never allowed himself to feel. Gratitude that had been delayed by decades. You saved me, he said, voice breaking. I lived a whole life because of you. I got years I wasn't supposed to have, and I never even thanked you. Tears gathered at the corners of Helen's eyes, but she shook her head softly, her expression full of grace rather than emotion. No, Michael, she whispered. All I did was bandage a wound. God did the saving. I just happened to be holding the cloth. Michael bowed his head, breath shaking, unable to hide the tears that escaped. Whatever hardness war had left in him seemed to loosen for the first time. He had spent years thinking no one had ever fought for him, thinking survival was something he clawed through alone. But here she was, living proof that grace had followed him long before he ever knew how to name it. Rex pressed his body against Michael's side, tail still, as if anchoring him in the moment. The dog didn't bark, didn't whine, just stayed, offering the quiet presence that only animals and angels seemed able to give without words. When Michael finally rose, something in his posture was different, not just softened, resolved. I can't repay what you did, he said, voice steadier now, but I can honor it. I'm not going to disappear this time. Helen smiled, and it was a smile that held the tenderness of someone who had lived long enough to understand the strange timing of life. You're already doing more than enough, she said. But Michael shook his head. Not yet. You've spent your life taking care of other people, and now it's my turn. He gestured lightly to the peeling paint, the sagging steps, the aging roof. I'm going to fix this house, all of it. Not just because it needs doing, but because you deserve to live in a place that's taken care of. Helen opened her mouth to protest, but he raised a gentle hand. This isn't charity, Helen. It's gratitude. With a hammer. Over the next week, the rhythm of their lives changed. Michael brought lumber, paint, new tools. He replaced the porch railings, rewired the flickering hallway lights, cleared out the rain gutters, fixed the roof shingles that rattled in the wind. He worked with the quiet focus of a man restoring something that meant more than wood or walls, something like balance. Helen joked that she needed to start charging him rent for all the hours he spent there, but Michael only replied that rent was paid in 1979 in a field hospital no one remembers but us. Sometimes he would drive her to her medical checkups, helping her out of the truck with a gentleness no one would have expected from a man with hands calloused from war and labor. She told him once that he treated her as if she were fragile, and he answered softly, "You treated me like I wasn't dying. I'm just returning the favor." Rex became part of the routine, too, following Helen everywhere inside the house and sleeping each evening at the foot of her chair, as if standing silent guard over a promise he understood better than both of them. Neighbors sometimes saw the trio together on the porch, Helen in her rocking chair, Michael sanding a board, Rex lying at her feet. And though no one knew the story, many felt something beautiful was happening there. On the final afternoon of repairs, Michael stepped back from the freshly painted porch railing, wiped the dust from his hands, and looked at Helen with a quiet smile. "There," he said. "Now it looks like a home again." Helen looked not at the house, but at him. "It always was," she said softly. "It just needed one more person in it." Michael didn't answer right away, but the truth of it settled gently between them. Some debts were not meant to be paid back, but carried forward. As the sun dipped behind the trees, Helen asked him a question she had been too shy to ask before. "Do you ever think God brings people back together on purpose?" Michael took a slow breath. "If you'd asked me that years ago, I would have said no. I thought life was just randomness mixed with survival. But now—" He glanced toward Rex, then back at her. "Now I think maybe every kindness is a seed. You just never know how long it takes to bloom." He paused, then spoke what would be the last words of the story the camera would hold. "Sometimes the person you save today returns one day to save you back. No act of kindness is ever wasted. God just waits for the right moment to send it home again. Sometimes the miracles we pray for do not arrive in the form we expect. They come through people, through a voice that comforts us when we are weak, through a hand that lifts us when we fall, through a kindness we once gave and forgot, until God sends it back to us in a new season of life." This story reminds us, no act of love ever disappears. God simply holds it and returns it when the time is right. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us, has God ever sent someone back into your life at the perfect time? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another story of faith, healing, and second chances. May God bless you, protect your family, and guide you with the same grace that reunited these two souls. Amen. If you want a shorter version, a Facebook caption, or a TikTok hook, just say short version or make Facebook post, and I will format it.